1 second. All right, Emily, Tom, take it ahead.
You want to go, Emily? Start?
I'll kick us off. Why not? Thank you for having us. It's really great to see people from all over the world have joined the call, so thank you. Carbon removal show. We started sort of exploring and researching for this podcast in November 2020, and spent the first few months really just diving into the research. We had a little team that we put together that consists of the three of us who are here. Henry is the researcher for our show, and Tom and I are the co-hosts. We also have executive producer, and project manager, as well as some great help from editors and music designers and all sorts. And we put this little team together, and it really came about because carbon removal is a topic that we all felt wasn't getting enough press. Not enough people were talking about it. And it was so important that we were like, we need to work on this. And we'd got some funding to do exactly that. So together as a team, we set out and started researching and interviewing pretty much anyone we could who was related to the field, which isn't a big field at the minute, which meant that we sort of covered it quite thoroughly, I think. And then, set about sort of framing all those interviews and all of our thoughts and learnings from that journey into 9 episodes of season 1 of the Carbon Removal Show.
Exactly that. One thing that I might add there is that we also realized that, I think as we were making it, we realized that we were making a show for someone like us who was really curious at the very start of our journey to learn about it and kind of get up to speed with the industry, but just didn't really have a convenient way of taking on the information, because it was either deeply scientific in journals and in blog pieces, or it was kind of quite hard to access. And so we felt that podcasting was a great medium for this. We kind of made something for us if we were kind of to start from scratch again, I guess.
Yeah, that's really awesome. I really like the approach also of just having someone who doesn't have prior knowledge and just kind of digging through, getting that knowledge, and in the process of that, just sharing what you find, right? I really like that. So in short, could you just explain what is carbon removal?
What is carbon removal? The big question. Tom, you can do this one.
Sure, okay. So we have an analogy that we use on the show, which tends to be quite useful at times. A lot of the time, it's quite hard to visualize all this stuff. So in short, carbon removal it does what it says on the tin, essentially. The whole point is removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, from the ambient air. The way to perhaps visualize that, if we imagine a bathtub, and lots of people cite this as an example, but if you imagine a bathtub and you have a tap which is filling the bath up, and that bath is filling with what we would say carbon dioxide. So the world is getting more and more kind of a higher kind of concentration of carbon dioxide. The tap is filling it up. That's kind of like your activities which are emitting carbon dioxide. That could be oil and gas extraction and burning. It could be in industrial agricultural practices, and that's a problem. And so what we want to do is we want to reduce the level in that bathtub. So one thing that we can do is we can turn the taps off, and that's kind of emissions reductions. It's what a lot of people talk about, stopping from emitting CO2 into the atmosphere through burning fossil fuels. But another thing that we can do is actually pull the plug. And for us, pulling the plug is carbon removal. And so there's a plethora of different technologies and approaches and solutions, you could say, that kind of work to remove that CO2 from the atmosphere. And that's kind of what we look at and dive into in season 1 of the carbon removal show. And there's a bit more nuance there, but I hope that analogy kind of makes sense. Do you want to add anything to that, Emily?
I love the bathtub analogy. Yeah, so one of the ways I like to think about it, is to sort of put it in the framework of the circular economy. And I'm sure that a lot of you are aware of the circular economy, of being more conscious of how we use resources, but also how we reuse and how we recycle resources. And if we think about carbon as a waste that we have to manage, you know, it's a pollutant, carbon dioxide is a pollutant, and we need to manage that waste. And carbon removal in that sense then is sort of the cleaning up, if you like, of our waste that we keep pumping into the atmosphere. As Tom said, there's one side where we say, okay, we need to stop pumping this waste into the atmosphere. Great. And then there's another side that says we have to clean this up. We have to scrub up, literally scrub the air and try and get some of that carbon out.
That makes sense. Yeah, I like that analogy too. That's really helpful. So I guess Emily and Tom, yeah, one thing that I found really interesting when doing a little bit of research and listening to your podcast was that, to me, carbon removal was always something very technical, right? It was something that, like, we're using a lot of technology. It's like very high tech. We're sucking it out of the air and like compressing it and everything. But I actually found that there's quite an array of natural and tech-based solutions. So could you maybe just give a brief overview of what the main ones are and kind of how they work?
Yes.
Sure.
Should I share that image, Emily? Would that be useful if I shared that on a screen?
Yeah, if you can do. While you're doing that, it's interesting what you said, Jennifer, because I think a lot of people have that idea as well, that there's so much tech, all these like machines, and they're pulling things out the air and whatever. As you can see here, there's an example of that right on this page that Tom was just sharing. That's it.
This one.
But actually, in nature, naturally, there are so many cycles and systems that pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And obviously, we know about trees. We know that forests are the lungs of the planet. But it's also oceans. It's also soils. There's these really comprehensive and fascinating cycles that naturally happen. And a lot of the carbon removal solutions that we talk about on the show are sort of ways to support those systems that are already in place in nature. So I loved the like diving into the nature-based stuff. It's so interesting. Tom, do you want to talk us through this graphic?
I can have a go. Okay, so yeah, as Emily said, and I'm not sure how familiar the rest of you guys are with the different kind of solutions or approaches that there are, but people tend to put them into these two buckets, and one is nature-based and the other is engineered. Now, as we spent time interviewing guests and researching the show, what we came to realize is it's actually more of a scale as opposed to just one or the other. And the graph that we're showing you here kind of shows that scale a little bit. So on the right-hand side, my right-hand side, hopefully it's your right-hand side as well, we've got something like reforestation or afforestation, which is more of, I guess, quote unquote nature-based. And then towards the other end, you've got the more kind of engineered approaches, which would be a direct air capture facility. And then at the far end on this graph, we've got enhanced rock weathering and ocean solutions. But we'll touch on each of these. If you really want to kind of go into more detail, listen to the carbon removal show, because we discuss most of these subjects in depth. There's a bit of a plug there. But yes, so to start on the right-hand side, you've got something like reforestation and afforestation. That is, reforestation is kind of taking a plot of land which used to have woodlands or forests on it or trees on it, and then reforesting it. So you're putting you're putting woodlands back into that area that may have been perhaps cleared for logging or something else. Afforestation is another similar process where, however, you're looking at kind of a piece of land that never historically had woodlands or forest on it, and then you're adding to that. So you're building a woodland, you're building a forest through different processes. You then kind of slide along a little bit and you've got something like regenerative agriculture, which supports soil carbon sequestration. So that is essentially locking CO2. And the whole point again here is locking CO2 away in something. With reforestation and afforestation, you're locking it into your trees, into the tree mass, and even the soil and the roots. With the soil carbon sequestration, again, it's focusing on locking carbon away as best you can into the soil, the top soil as we call it, which is the top, like, I don't know, 50 centimeters to a meter of soil of kind of across our lands, and trying to enhance the sequestration potential of that. Then you kind of go into a little bit of a mix where it kind of goes a bit engineered, but it's also still a bit of nature. And this is when we talk about something called biochar, which is one approach, and then another one called BECCS, or bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. There's loads of acronyms in this space, so that's probably the first of many we'll discuss. But biochar and BECCS, very similar at the very start of the process for both of them, in that you're growing biomass. So you're growing a plant, for example. It could be like a maize crop. So you grow that crop and then you harvest it and then you burn it, or you pyrolyze it, whether it's the case of biochar. So you burn it at a really high heat, remove oxygen, and then what you get is this kind of charcoal-like substance, which is very, very carbon dense. And then you can use that and stick it into soil, or you can do something else with it, and then you can kind of lock the carbon that was in the atmosphere, which has been stored into that biomass and then locked away in the biochar. With BECCS, what you're doing is you're burning that biomass, but then you're generating some sort of perhaps energy from the back of it. It could be you're burning the biomass and you stick a carbon capture device at the end of it to then capture the CO2 that's burnt off, but then you're generating steam and electricity, or you create some sort of biofuel from that as well. Do you want to take the other ones, Emily, or shall I carry on?
I was actually going to just harp in and say that as well as growing crops specifically for this purpose, you can use waste biomass. So especially if you're in a place where there's particular food production industry and they have a waste product like a seeds or the shells or something like that, that can be used in these processes as well. So it can become that circular, start to be that circular economy that we talked about already. Yeah, we also touched on direct air capture in season 1, which is like very much the technical sort of end of the spectrum, the tech-based spectrum, and is literally that thing that you imagine when you talk about pulling carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And these fans that you can see on this nice picture are exactly how it's done. We actually don't in season 1 touch on chemical weathering or the blue carbon yet. Keep your eyes peeled for season 2 coming soon. Maybe not super soon, but coming. And there's loads to dive into there as well. They're also nature-based, but it's interesting. We talked about this, nature-based and tech, and then Tom was saying it's a spectrum, and then he started talking about planting trees, and I can imagine people being like, well, I don't understand how that's tech-based, just plant a tree, there's no tech involved. And that was what surprised me as well, is that even in the nature-based solutions, tech is involved. And it seems sort of obvious. We're in the 21st century. Tech's involved in all of these things, and is the rate at which the technology is developing is really impressive to help improve these solutions, to help with measuring, to help with to reduce resource use, all sorts of things involving sort of technological solutions within also the nature-based solutions. It's really cool.
That's really nice. Thank you, Emily and Tom. I really like this graph too. It kind of puts it simple and nicely to see the whole bandwidth. So
something just to add to that is probably traditionally what you're seeing at the moment as well is if you have a more nature-based solution on the right hand side, it's generally less expensive than something that's on the more engineered side. So again, there's the spectrum of cost. There's loads of other things that you need to take into account, but like generally there's a bit of a positive correlation between how nature-based it is and how engineered it is, and then the cost kind of difference there as well.
Yeah, and what's more, I'd say this little graph, this little infographic is not exhaustive. It's sort of the main solutions that we're looking at right now in 2022, but things are changing all the time. So there's new solutions coming, but also there's, you know, other exciting things and bits that are sort of this, but not really, and can fit into their own category. So yeah, it's quite a dense web, really, all the different solutions that you can find out there.
That makes sense. So what role does all of this play in our goal of getting to like 1.5 or 2 degrees warming max? And I guess related to this, and feel free to answer this separately, but yeah, do we, you know, is it enough for us to just go net zero and have cities that are not emitting? Or do you feel like, you know, carbon removal necessarily, like you said, like you have the bathtub, is it enough to just stop? Or do we actually need to pull that plug?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think, I mean, you know, in terms of the net zero question, obviously, in an ideal world, we would love it if cities could get to the point where where it's like negative emissions. They're actually not, they're going beyond net zero to a point where they're not emitting and they're capturing carbon. That's the ideal world. We don't live in an ideal world yet. So we need to be a bit more realistic. And I think in that, we can sort of start to see where carbon removal might fit into a plan of climate impact. So we talked about the bathtub and making sure that we turn off those taps and also unplug the bath. And I think that that's the key thing, right? Is that this cannot be a substitute for emissions reduction. Just cannot. It's only going to be viable if it's happening alongside emissions reduction. But at the same time, if we only try and turn off the taps, these taps are proving difficult to turn off. There are some industries that are going to be really, really difficult to turn off that tap of carbon dioxide emissions. Maybe impossible, who knows? And in the meantime, if we don't start getting the water out of the bath, then we're going to have such a mess on our hands. And to put it a bit more scientifically, instead of me just talking about bathtubs, the IPCC report explicitly states that in order to reach 1.5 degrees, there isn't a scenario that does at least a bit of carbon removal. That all of the scenarios that they model include some example of a carbon removal solution. And I think that sort of says it all, really, is that we're not doing the turning off the tap quick enough. And as well, we're in 2022. So if we were having this conversation in 1970 and somebody was talking about starting to unplug the bath, I was like, well, we haven't even tried turning the taps off properly yet. Let's just focus on that, please. I wasn't alive in 1970, so nobody would have listened to me anyway. But now we have got to that point where we've tried to turn the taps off and we're just not doing it quick enough. We're not doing it well enough. We need to start pulling out the plug. I'm not really sure if that answers your question at all, but I'm going to hand over to Tom anyway, because He was probably listening to the question more than I was.
No, I think you waxed lyrical on that. And yeah, and like, feel free, anyone's got questions, or even if they don't disagree with us on some of these points, like, please feel free to send some thoughts through. But the point that really made me realize the need for carbon removal and reaching our 1.5 degree or 2 degree goals, preferably not 2 degrees, ideally 1.5 degree, was, as Emily was saying, in that IPCC report, and then some further reading that we went into, even if we turned off, all of our emissions tomorrow, there would still be enough. Oh, I think someone's literally just saying it now. Yeah, even if we turned off all of our emissions tomorrow, there'd still be enough residual CO2 in the atmosphere that would bring our temperature up to 1.5 degrees or more. So it's kind of, we're too far gone now. We kind of it's a necessity to bring carbon removal into the fold here of our its climate solutions, I guess. Yeah, and it kind of goes on to the net zero piece, which we haven't really touched on so much. So should we talk about that briefly?
Yeah, if you feel like there's something else to say. I mean, Sam, you definitely underwrote that point, I think, if we stop emitting today. Yeah, but is there something else that you would want to mention on the net zero?
Yeah, Sammy took the words right out of my mouth. Maybe you should they should come and the conversation. Feel free to. But yeah, in terms of net zero, is an interesting piece about net zero in that there isn't necessarily a universal definition of it yet. So lots of people read into it however they wish to. For example, if you're historically an oil and gas company, you might look at net zero and think, okay, great, that gives me a license to pollute, and I can just offset everything through carbon removal. Whereas if you're a more have a stronger moral compass, you might look at setting a science-based target that is net zero, which means that you're focusing ultimately first, you're prioritizing your reduction strategy, and then those hard to abate parts of your scope emissions, whether that's 5, 10, 15% that you just cannot avoid, those are the bits that you focus on when it comes to carbon removal. And so I think it kind of it depends how you kind of define net zero. I think Emily and I would both very strongly define net zero as that latter, which is setting a very rigid science-based target, which then also will include carbon removal to kind of offset that kind of final piece of the puzzle. And there's also kind of separately from that, there's also this movement of companies that are looking to pledge to remove their legacy emissions. So Microsoft is an example of a company doing that at the moment. They're looking to remove all historical emissions, and so they can only do that. It's only possible for them to do that through carbon removal. That
piece about, there's net zero and then there's net zero. It's not one thing, and I think that's really important to bear in mind. And I also think it's important to bear in mind that we also need to look beyond net zero. Like, if we set net zero as a target for 2030 or 2040, great, but we have to understand that it's a stepping stone. We're going in 2050. Where do we need to be by then? To me, it doesn't feel like the end point. It just feels like one of the stepping stones along the way.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I think that's maybe what we're sometimes losing sight of, right? It's like achieving a certain stepping stone like that doesn't necessarily mean that we're done, right? There's probably a lot more work to be done after that. So I guess like diving into that all sounds really promising. And I think also listening to the podcast made me kind of rethink my stance on carbon removal in terms of like it being a lot more necessary than I previously thought it was. So what about the challenges of carbon removal? So maybe just to mention a few, like the ones I came across was definitely land use, which for a lot of the technologies, it takes quite a bit of land away. There's also issues or concerns around electricity use and maybe some biodiversity loss or conflict. Could you maybe just talk to those, either pick one of those or give a brief overview?
Definitely. I could do a few, Emily, and you could pick up some others, or we could switch it around.
Sure.
Okay. I'll kick off with a couple. And yeah, so one thing that we kind of like have this list that we go through on the show as well of kind of key things to look at when you're comparing each different approach. First thing to bear in mind is that every approach will have its pros and cons. There's always going to be this like sliding scale of like benefits, costs, like analysis. The first and the most obvious one that I think a lot of people focus around is that level of permanence. And what we say by that is we kind of mean how long is that carbon that we've drawn down, captured, how long is that going to be stored somewhere? Like how long will it be stored in that tree in the woods? How long will it be stored permanently underground once it's been captured by a direct air capture facility? Ideally, the longer the better. In order for us to have the best kind of impact that we want, you'd want to really look at like levels that are reaching hundreds, thousands of years of permanence. But there are other solutions out there which just can't guarantee that. So you've got kind of soil carbon sequestration, for example. It's really, really tough to be able to confidently say this carbon's going to be locked away here for 100 years. And so there are interesting companies out there that kind of are pledging 5-10 year kind of levels of storage. So there's that permanence as one. Secondly, scalability. How like does this approach have the potential to scale to millions, if not billions, of tons of CO2 removal? As we said before, and the IPCC reports in 2018 and thereafter, we need to get to a gigaton scale. And what we mean by that is 1 billion tons. That's a huge, huge amount, like on par with I think if you look at something like 10 gigatons, which is the total which we could be removing by 2050, that's equivalent to double the US's annual emissions. So it's a big, big number. And we need to look at potential solutions that can get to that scalable level. Otherwise, it's not necessarily so useful for us. Another one's cost. How expensive is it? Is it going to cost us $50 to $100 a ton? Is it going to cost $1,000 a ton? We kind of touched on that one already. The more nature-based side of things, it's generally a little bit less expensive. The more engineered side of things, it's generally more expensive. I think you can get something like a soil carbon sequestration credit for about $40 at the moment from companies like Nori. That's probably on the cheapest end. And then you've got something like a Climeworks or a Carbon Engineering, which is direct air capture, which are charging anywhere from $600 to $1,000 per ton. So there's, we have the saying of like no ton is created equal in that regard. Emily, you got a few more.
I think, yeah, this is the thing. So with all of the challenges of carbon removal, Jennifer, you've mentioned some, Tom, you've mentioned some. The other one I want to mention specifically is additionality. So that means just making sure that the carbon that you are removing or the carbon you're paying to be removed was actually I always get my words in a mess when I'm describing this, was genuinely a problem in the first place. It's this thing of like plus and minus and negative and positive. It gets my head all in a mess. That it's actually genuinely additional carbon that's being removed. But what I was going to say wasn't about that specifically. I was going to talk more generally about these challenges and just say that Tom ended by saying that there's no 2 tons created equal. And I think that that's really the point about the challenges of the carbon removal solutions, is that, resource use, land use, scalability, etc. It all comes down to context and to conditions. And with every solution that we implement around carbon removal, there's so many questions to be asked about, how has this land been used historically and whose land is it, and can we now use it effectively, and is this going to be taking away from something else? Is this money going to be taking away from something else? Is this these technological solutions, are they actually costing us more in energy than we're pulling out of the atmosphere? All of these questions, and the answer is going to be different in every single circumstance. So there's no way to say, okay, we can't do this because it's this, we can't do that because it's this. And I think that in general, as sort of especially the climate crisis and climate action has become more mainstream, that systems thinking, that question of looking at the nuance and looking at conditions, is just become a bit more commonplace. And I think that that's going to be so helpful in terms of the carbon removal industry. I think for me, when we were making the show, one of the most interesting challenges was when we were looking at the sort of the potential social impacts of these carbon removal solutions. And in some cases, it can have some great benefits, especially around the nature-based solutions. There's a lot of really cool social and I guess like societal benefits that come from some of those nature-based solutions. And then there's other times when really it can be a hardship on people or communities. And I'm thinking about afforestation and reforestation, where we just think, oh well, we're just planting trees, it's fine, everyone loves trees are good for us, trees are good for the world, done. But the thing about planting trees is not really planting them, it's allowing them to grow and maintaining them. And that question of permanence that Tom pointed out, a tree can so easily be torn down, burnt down, and then you haven't actually captured any carbon. So so then the question becomes, taking care of these lands, and is that fall on the local people, and do they have the skill set, and is that an income generating activity? There's many questions, and I think that there's no sort of, maybe we need like a checklist of things, but even that would have to be so exhaustive, it doesn't make any sense. But it really is context specific, and I think that's one of the big challenges with all this.
Definitely.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. I think Henry just seconded that, saying that there's just a lot of challenges that we don't really know, or that we know but are just have to work through on various levels.
Yeah, and also the scale, the fact that it is small scale, as Henry wrote, at the minute there's no understanding of how much of any one solution we're going to actually end up with. And it might be that once we get to 2030, we've got so much direct air capture that it becomes a big problem in X, Y, or Z. And then you understand, this big web of solutions that we were talking about, and the different examples that Tom showed on the screen, how they can all work together in sort of that, that portfolio of solutions is so important, so that we don't fall into these pitfalls of, oh well, this one's using too much land and this one's using too much water or whatever. It's actually a great game that Tom and I played was it the final episode we did, Tom, in season 1?
I think it was the final one.
I can't remember. Will you post the link in the chat, Tom? It's an online game where essentially you get to choose which carbon removal solution. It's called Road to 10 gigatons, that's it. And you get to choose which sort of portfolio of carbon solutions you put together in order to get to 10 gigatons carbon removal. And it'll say, oh no, there's an alert because you've used up too much land, or like, this is great because it also has a benefit of biodiversity protection or whatever. And it's that sort of balancing act of like, okay, a little bit of this and a little bit of that, or a bit less of that, a bit more of this, and whatever. It's a super interesting game, and I was a bit addicted for a little while.
And you can achieve it. There is a yeah, you can win in a way.
That's
Yeah.
really cool. Yeah, so for everyone listening to this later on the recording, so the link is road to 10gigatons.com if you want to play that game. It sounds interesting. It's always surprising what people come up with. I think it's really cool. Just gamifying the challenge. So I guess
Yeah.
staying with challenges, and you briefly touched on this, basically calculating how much carbon is removed, and doing this for either credit or within companies to see that they actually get down to zero, offsetting emissions they can't really otherwise prevent. How easy or hard is it, and how good are the ways of calculating the amount of carbon that is removed by any of those technologies?
Yeah, well, it's not easy. In short, it's really difficult. It's easier for some of those solutions than it is for others. And the spectrum that we talked about, from tech solutions to nature-based solutions, the nature-based solutions are more difficult. There's much more variability in terms of carbon sequestration potential. And we just have less control over the nature-based solutions in so many ways. Having said that, as we were researching and talking to experts in the industry and practitioners across the industry, we discovered that there's a lot going on in making the measurements more accurate and super interesting. So you would think that it's probably really difficult to look at a rainforest and say how much carbon is being sequestered by this rainforest, which it really is. But we had a great time interviewing Diego Saez-Gil from Pachama. And one of the things that Pachama does as an organization is looking at monitoring large scale forests. So like we're talking rainforests and big sections of land, and measuring how much carbon is sequestered in those trees and forests. It's super interesting, very sort of sci-fi tech stuff going into the nature-based solutions there.
And to add to that, to what Emily was saying, as you look at on that spectrum, nature-based, slightly more tricky to be able to kind of definitively put a number on how much carbon is sequestered in a tree. Again, it's very circumstantial. Generally, I think rule of thumb is there's better potential with a tree that's closer to the equator to store more carbon in it than there is one that's further north, and such. We need to dig out the numbers from, but you can listen again. I think it's episode 2 on that forestry one, which tells you exactly kind of like the potential for each tree to sequester. I think Diego quoted something about some of the largest trees in the world can store up to 300 tons in them. But then you've also got 300 tons a hectare. Apologies. But then you've also got the engineered solutions like a direct air capture, where you can very accurately measure the amount of the amount of molecules of CO2 that you captured and are storing underground. So there's something there. But something that I want to just touch on is the fact that a lot of people will in the papers, for example, they'll write off certain solutions at this point in time and say, soil, for example, soil carbon sequestration. A lot of people write that off as a solution because they just say it's too tough to reliably measure the potential of storing carbon in your topsoil. However, as one of our guests puts it, an investor called Andrew Shebier, he says that kind of rightly that carbon removal is like in its teenage years and it's got lots of growing to do. And yes, there may be some mistakes that the industry makes. Yes, it may not be super reliable at this point in time, but the whole point is we're meant to, in order for the industry to grow, we're meant to invest time, money, resources. And in order for it to get to the scale and the potential that we need it to get to by 2050, we need to invest now in order to improve it for the future. So there isn't any point in writing off a different solution at this point in time, because we just don't know how we can improve on them.
That makes sense. Thank you both. So we actually get some questions from the audience. So Juan was
Great.
saying CO2 equivalent is what we are focusing on, but when it comes to heating the planet, is methane a higher contributing factor in temperature increase?
So I'm going to pass to Henry on this, but I believe Henry, our resident scientist, I believe that carbon stays in the atmosphere longer than methane does. And that's one of the big issues with carbon dioxide, is that it stays in the atmosphere for so long. Am I right, Henry? Did I get it right?
Yeah. Yeah. So a lot of what this is focused on is carbon dioxide removal. And as you probably know, that's the most common greenhouse gas. And it also stays in the atmosphere for a long, long time. So it tends to, I mean, obviously there's a lot of variation, but it's in the order of hundreds to thousands of years that CO2 emitted now could stay in the atmosphere. Methane in the shorter term, so say over the next 20, 30 years, if it's emitted now, can have a really potent effect. And so actually for keeping temperature rise below 2 degrees and below 1.5 degrees, avoiding methane emissions is crucial. And carbon dioxide removal is not going to do anything about that. There is a kind of quite a niche field, as I understand it, of methane removal. And
even more
that's
than CO2 removal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
and that I really don't know much about that, but other than it's actually pretty technically challenging. But if we could find some ways to make methane removal work, then that could really have quite an impact on like how far we can limit temperature increase. So yeah, I think your question is absolutely right that methane. You're absolutely right that methane does per gram contribute more to global warming. But it's a bit more. But over the longer term, I guess CO2 has that longer term impact.
So something just to add on to that as well on the, I mean, they're both very important, and in the more recent COP26 event, there was a lot of chat about methane capture as well. And I think there is a lot of work that's going to start to be happening there. The other thing as Henry points out, like the challenge is that CO2 concentrations are far higher in the atmosphere, although there are only 414 parts per million. So for every million parts, there's only 414 parts of CO2. Still very small, but still quite a lot larger than the parts per million that methane has. I can't remember what that stat is. I don't know if you know it, Henry, but it's significantly less than CO2. So it's just far more difficult to capture it and to sequester it.
Sorry, was
not
that a
know the answer. No. Just say in case you knew it. But yeah.
Sorry, I was busy reading Matthew's question. So.
Wait, should we repeat the question? Are you saying, Henry, that you didn't hear the question that Tom had?
Yes, sorry. Yeah.
Okay. No,
I was. Yeah, so, no. Don't worry about it wasn't really a question. It was just I just said that parts per million of CO2 is far greater than the parts per million that methane has in the atmosphere, and just the fact that it's so CO2 is so minuscule anyway. But the fact that methane is even more so just makes it 10x more difficult to build a direct air capture facility for methane, for example. But there's work going on there. I'll shut up now.
Thank you. You're all good. That's what you're here for, Tom. Okay, so now we're getting to the question from Matthew. Reading the National Academics report, they estimate there is a roughly 10 gigatons per year limit to capture and sequestration without large-scale land use change. Do you agree with that number? The report also mentioned afforestation and reforestation maxes out at 1 gigaton CO2 per year without major reforestation efforts. Should that emphasize other tech with larger scale?
I can have a go, unless you want to tackle this one first, Emily.
No, go for it, Tom.
Yeah, so most, yeah, like, so the number, yeah, the 10 gigatons seems to be the number that most people land on when it comes to the kind of like total amount of CO2 that we need to be kind of at the max, removing from the atmosphere come 2050. It doesn't necessarily mean to say that we can't go beyond that, but you're very right in that it will have an impact on land use change. And I think the point here is that we need to have the portfolio approach again, just to raise that. Like, you can't just focus on reforestation. If we reforested and afforested as our only carbon removal solution, we wouldn't have enough land. It's impossible. And so kind of, if you that was a dilemma we came up against, actually, when we started thinking like, okay, there's all these net zero pledges that these corporations and these governments are making, but the majority of them are for forestry projects, but there's not enough forests, let alone land, for us to be able to do that. So it just highlights the need to have that myriad of different approaches. And so I don't know the exact specific kind of limits, but yeah, like reforestation and other projects like that will have a cap, and that cap is dependent on how much land we as a society are willing to give up, or how much we're physically able to give up, given the competing use of kind of needing croplands and everything else. So
yeah,
I would
think
emphasize,
the other thing
yeah,
to say.
yeah, go on.
Yeah, sorry, Tom, I didn't mean to interrupt. I think exactly that the all those numbers highlight the importance of using all of the solutions at our disposal. And I think the other thing to say is that it seems to me, from the people we've spoken to and the research we've done, that this industry is just moving so fast. There's like lightning speed innovation happening. And so to say, oh, actually, we can only capture X amount of carbon dioxide without having an impact on land use. I mean, I think that number would probably only be correct for a matter of months, just because of the amount of change and innovation that's happening, the amount of research and also funding that's starting to be pumped into carbon removal. Elon Musk, thank you. But yeah, I think that it's really weird, or not weird, it's just really sticky to put numbers on that, because it just doesn't last for long, if that makes sense.
It does. Thank you, Emily. Okay, I'm going over to a question from Sammy. As individuals, what is a better use of our ability to give effectively? Buy carbon offsets for more technology-focused high cost solutions, for example, BAC, cheaper carbon offsets, natural, to remove all our footprint or support climate advocacy, for example, Founders Pledge Climate Fund. I personally split my environmental giving 50-50 between Climeworks, BAC, and Founders Pledge Climate Fund, but interested to know if that is the most effective split.
Good question.
It's a good question. I honestly don't really know the answer to that. I feel like we've just been talking about this portfolio approach and the importance of having lots of different, fingers in different pies. And if you've only got limited funds to contribute to that, it can be really difficult to sort of choose where you put your fingers, which pies you put them in. And maybe it comes down to projects that you personally trust. Because I think, as we mentioned, with all the challenges of this, there is so much out there that is really trying and doing a really good job at what they can, and there's other projects out there that are just planting trees and saying that they're removing carbon, and probably monoculture trees and not even the good diverse stuff. So I think that projects that you trust would be top of the list, no matter what kind of carbon removal that is, because hopefully we've got enough people or we can get enough people interested in this field to generate some kind of diversity across where projects are focusing themselves and where money's going. But yeah, they have to be done well, and I think that's top of the list for me.
Top of the list for me, which I probably wouldn't have thought so much about before getting into this, is almost even just kind of talking about it. Kind of give your time to research, and also take time to speak to people about this industry. Reason being, when we spoke with a researcher, a woman called Emily Cox, she conducted a really interesting study on the public perception of carbon removal. And this was done, I think, in 2020, so perception's probably increased a bit since then. But you know, the understanding of this industry was startlingly low. I think there was something like 3% of people in the UK really understood this, and like 7% of Americans understood this industry. And so, if we, as the general public, don't understand this technology, this new innovative industry, how can we get behind something like this in the future? So I think having conversations and talking openly and kind of sharing your thoughts on it, I think is one thing that you can do to kind of have to give effectively in a way. And the second thing as well, kind of the thing that we do focus a lot about, is on the education. And there are lots of people who will kind of put carbon removal into this bucket of offsets more broadly, whether that's an avoidance offset, which could be like building solar plants, or kind of maintaining forests, put them into this broader bucket and kind of lump it all together. And it's kind of very different from that. So you kind of want to make sure that people understand that carbon removal, it is its own separate entity away from something like an avoidance offset. And a lot of people, when they understand that, it then kind of clicks and makes more sense, because there's a lot of kind of legacy skepticism around the traditional offset industry that's been around for 20 plus years, and rightfully so. And so we're kind of wanting to make sure that carbon removal doesn't fall into that bracket, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you, Tom and Emily. So we have one other question from Sasha. I will fly next month and would like to donate to offset the CO2 footprint of the flight for me and my family. Which organization would you suggest to donate to, and what dollar per ton would you suggest? So Sasha heard of the range being from $30 to $1,000.
Yeah, it's quite a range.
I'm actually quite curious about that too.
I'm going to think of it. There's
Henry, you unmuted. Did you want to say something?
I mean, I guess it kind of spans across the last question and this question a bit. And I promised that this, I'm saying this of my own accord, even though the show is sponsored by them. But patch.io they kind of offer a bit more transparency on how you can offset. I haven't actually kind of dug really deeply into the services that they offer, but from the sounds of it, you can put your money into a portfolio of different approaches, and there's a bit more assurance there that you're paying into some actual offsets that are actually removing that carbon. So I would recommend having a look at what patch.io offer. I think a lot of their service is oriented towards organizations and how organizations can remove the carbon that they emit. But I think there might be some information on their website as well that can help individuals.
And
Here's
also
a
on Emily's
question.
point, go on.
No, you go, Tom. I wasn't going to answer. I was going to ask another question.
I'm not going to try and answer, but I'm going to just say that to Emily's point, you know, Sasha, it depends on what you kind of identify with in the different approaches. You know, if you think that from what you've heard today, for example, and if you've researched other solutions, if you kind of feel more strongly about soil carbon sequestration as a solution, then you should look at supporting that area. Or if you kind of believe more in kind of an engineered direct air capture solution, then you should look at that. We can post a couple of links, but one is Climeworks, their direct air capture. Someone's already mentioned them. You can specifically remove kind of kilograms, I think, on their website, as opposed to full tons, because if you removed a whole ton, it'd be very expensive. But then there's, Nori is a good example of soil carbon sequestration, which you can purchase. And there's also other good websites like, what are they called? Puro.earth. They are a biochar kind of marketplace. There's Gold Standard, who will have a bunch of things on their website as well. So it just takes a little bit of time to look into them, but there are options that you can pick.
And sorry, I know we're short on time, but I just thought I'd mention something that one of the investors we interviewed, I can't remember quite who it was, but they were talking about they would prefer to see rather than a focus on net zero or carbon neutrality, they would prefer to see a focus on climate positivity, as they called it. So the idea there being that for a flight, you would somehow set out how much you were willing to pay, and then pay that into the most effective option. So even if that doesn't fully offset all the kilograms associated with the flight that you've taken, it's had a more climate positive impact than using that same amount of resource and spending it all on forest offsets, which then kind of, I don't know, that I don't want to cast shade on any solution more than another, but there have been some scandals to do with offsetting in forestry projects. And so basically the point was just, you may want to consider just offsetting part of the kilograms of carbon dioxide, but offsetting that permanently rather than offsetting it all, but for 10 years.
I think the bottom line might be, this is just because you're paying more per ton of carbon does not mean it's a better solution. There are plenty of really good reforestation and afforestation options that are actually quite cheap to contribute to. And that's still a great option. And then there's stuff on the higher end, like the direct air capture, that's going to cost you a lot more money. And there's no guarantee that all those companies are, ticking all the boxes in the way that they need to be ticked. So I think, unfortunately, there's no simple answer to that question, except a little bit of research.
Thank you, Emily. I'll also be collecting all the links you just mentioned, and we'll just put them in the next Effective Environmentalism newsletter. If anyone wants to dive deeper into those, and you can definitely have a look at those. So yeah, we're actually already 4 minutes over, but maybe really briefly, do you guys want to just say what's next for the carbon removal show?
Yeah.
What's next for the carbon removal show? Well, season 2 is what's next. As we mentioned, we had such a great time making season 1 and diving into this topic and talking to lots of experts and practitioners in this field. But there's still a lot that we haven't covered. There's still a lot of questions, and what's more, I think there's growing interest and growing buzz about carbon removal. So we want to make sure that we can offer our listeners a sort of overview and insights into that, and to continue learning alongside us with all of that. We're also really keen to know, especially from people like you all here today, what do you want to hear from us? What do you want the carbon removal show to be? You can tweet us or email us or whatever to answer that question if you can't think of the answer right now. Yeah, I think that's the future for us. Tom, do you have other things that we are doing in the future?
Yeah, no, so season 2, we are also looking to get out there a bit more. I think something that we perhaps are looking into is kind of like getting more on the ground almost. Speaking to people that are doing the things where they're actually happening, whether that's a project or something else. I think it's quite exciting. Yeah, there's also loads of resources that we can send across to you guys that you helped us on our kind of journey of discovery. There's great communities like Slack groups and things. There's games, there's not-for-profits that spend all their time kind of advocating for this space. Other podcasts, God forbid, but they're all really good. So happily share those with you guys. And I just seen a last comment, which was from Matthew on the kind of, what was it, caring about human, animal, or ecological impacts of climate change. There are much better options in each of those areas directly. Yeah, like you make a really good point, like Matthew, like direct carbon removal. It's just one of a of a flurry of climate solutions out there. And if we dropped everything and just focused on carbon removal, that wouldn't be the right thing to do. As Emily said at the start, when it comes to your emissions reductions, for example, you need to complement it with carbon removal. You've also got biodiversity challenges. And so as we kind of like to look at it, just have this kind of more holistic, systemic approach where there's like loads of things that we should be looking at, but you obviously can't look at every single one. We've chosen to focus on carbon removal for the time being because we think that it needs to get a higher public profile out there. But yeah, you make a great point.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to wrap it up right here. Thank you for everyone who listened in, and especially thank you to Tom, Emily, and Henry. This has been really informative. It's really cool to hear that you're planning to do more on this. So yeah, I'm really curious to hear about the second season. Definitely let me know when that comes out, and I can also share in the newsletters for any listeners who are getting our newsletters, so you can just stay up to date that way. Yeah, and I wish all of you either a good day, good night, wherever you may be. And thank you again, Tom, Emily, and or good morning, yeah, and Henry. Yeah, it's been really nice, and we'll be awaiting season 2.
Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for having us.